Hi, it's Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. So I've made a couple of posts recently about the Venezuelan boat strikes. The boat strikes conducted by the U.S. military in the Caribbean against supposed Venezuelan drug vessels. In response to those videos, one of our listeners came back with a set of questions. And look, we love questions. Send us any questions that you have. Our purpose in making these videos is to educate the public on matters of national interest. So we definitely want to know what's on your mind. What are you curious about? Send us your thoughts. This listener in particular asked us a series of questions about whether these war crimes could also be considered crimes against humanity, and if so, whether the people involved might face justice in some sort of international tribunal like the International Criminal Court. I'm going to slightly reframe those questions. And actually, we're going to release two different videos in response. There are two topics here that intersect, and unfortunately, I can't do justice by either of them in a single video. In this first video, we're going to discuss the difference between war crimes and crimes against humanity and where those concepts come from. In a later video, I'm going to talk about how those things are enforced, and that question gets to some nuanced foreign policy about the United States with regard to the International Criminal Court. That requires a video unto itself. Okay, so what is a war crime? Well, a war crime is any act that violates the laws of armed conflict. In general, when we're talking about the laws of armed conflict, we're referring to the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions are essentially a restatement, a distillation of most of the customary laws of armed conflict, the rules that civilized nations follow when conducting warfare in as humane a way as possible. Now, is there a cogent argument that warfare is inherently inhumane? Yes. But even so, the quote-unquote civilized nations of the world have come up with a set of rules that every country is supposed to follow when conducting a war. A war crime is a violation of those rules. The Geneva Conventions cover most of the acts that modern nations would consider to be war crimes, but not all. There are some war crimes that are not necessarily defined in the Geneva Conventions. But in general, I'm going to use the Geneva Conventions and violations of the Geneva Conventions as shorthand for war crimes. The concept of war crimes has been around much longer than the concept of crimes against humanity, which I'll cover in just a moment. The concept of a war crime has been around since at least the early 1800s. And in fact, one of the early attempts to codify, which means to write down and standardize the idea of a war crime, was something called the Lieber Code, which was actually a codification of the rules of warfare by the Union Army during the American Civil War. The concept has expanded from there. In general, any violation of the customary laws of armed conflict is considered a war crime. Importantly, a single act that is in violation of those laws is considered a war crime. Those violations don't need to be systematic, and they don't necessarily need to be a matter of national policy. So, for instance, senior members of the U.S. military ordering a strike on people who are stranded at sea would be a war crime. That would be the case regardless of whether that strike was part of a broader pattern of persecution of any particular group of individuals. Crimes against humanity are a slightly newer concept. The idea of a crime against humanity didn't even really exist until the Nuremberg Trials after World War II. Now, as a practical matter, crimes against humanity require that there be a systemic persecution of a group of people, almost always civilians. That is a matter of not national policy, at least the policy of a particular group. The Holocaust, perpetrated by the Nazi Party of Germany, would be a good example. It just so happens there's a pretty great movie out right now about the Nuremberg Trials, and I highly encourage everybody to go see it. To summarize, as a practical matter, the difference between a war crime and a crime against humanity is that a war crime can be a single act, whereas a crime against humanity requires a specific policy of sustained actions against a group of people, usually civilians. This topic gets a lot more complicated when you start talking about enforcement. Who is responsible for prosecuting war crimes and who is responsible for prosecuting crimes against humanity gets to some pretty sticky foreign policy. We'll get to those topics in the next video.